the greatest tragedy in all this is Ukraine. I mean, and Zelensky himself will go down as a tragic figure. You'll have, there are corruption charges against today Zelensky's close circle. Now people will say, look, the same guy was being hailed as a hero.
Yeah.
Now he'll be hailed as a betrayer, as someone who let down the country, or you could say, look, he allowed this loss for nothing.
Yeah.
So all kinds of arguments will be made. And I think when you lose, the number of people will throw stones at you, will always be more. They woke up too late. And the whole hope was Americans. For 75 years, Americans have done the heavy lifting. So Americans will continue to do it. So there is that duality in their position. On the one hand, say there's unprincipled, that Russia has no friends in Washington. If the US pulls out, they can't really fill the gap. So the so-called peace plan over the last 48 hours was really Americans must stay on, but should not make compromises with Russia. So what they're going to do is really campaign in Washington, mobilize the opposition to Trump, generate a lot of noise, which is what they'll do. So it's really a terrible position in Europe. The challenging task for India is, look, there is a dynamic situation between US, China, and Russia. Friends, enemies, frenemies, all kinds of relationships, the aspects of the relationship that they'll have.
So this week in Mandala, you've looked at arguably the newsiest thing happening in global affairs, which is Trump's plan for peace in between Russia and Ukraine. Critics have argued, including many European capitals, that it's giving away the baby with the bathwater. It emboldens Russia, too many concessions on territory, NATO membership, all the core points that were arguably Russia's reasons for starting the invasion all those years ago. But if we take a look at it, which you mentioned in the column, of course, but from the perspective of Ukraine, the Ukraine people who have been now in this sort of embattled mode for many years, going on 4 years, and it'll be, you look at that, is it that Zelensky, some of his critics have argued now that he's been so caught up in becoming an international figure, sort of holding things together, that he should have gone for a deal earlier when there were better terms possible, that you've left it too long, and Russia itself, as you argue, believes that the longer it goes, the more it benefits Russia, the conflict.
I think, it's really the greatest tragedy in all this is Ukraine. I mean, and Zelensky himself will go down as a tragic figure.
Yeah.
That in 22, when everyone thought he would just run away, he stood up and defended. But I think it brings us to the larger picture, when you take on a big power and the global politics take over, you're not in control. So, he had to depend on the American support and the European support. Now, each of these countries have their own domestic politics. Russians violated, the sovereign, but in the end, what matters is what happens on the ground. I mean, I think in our, if you win, it's fine. But the thing is, in international politics, the brutality of using force, those who win are the Jo Jeeta Huwa Sikandar. I mean, I think it becomes, and your tragedy was you're not in control. You depended on the Americans, and the Americans might change their mind. And when they change their mind, they create all kinds of problems. They're talking about corruption in Ukraine now. See, the same story in Afghanistan. As long as they decided to support Kabul against the Taliban, it's fine. But when they change the mind, it's, the regime was corrupt, they were responsible for the failure. So that's one part. I think when your fate is in the hands of other powers, then I think it is really the question of what happens between them takes over. And I think then it's legitimate to ask, why did we sacrifice so much? If we had to give 20% to the territory, we could have got a better deal. Certainly in March, April 22, when the Turks were mediating between Russia and Ukraine, I mean, they could have had a deal. So I think those questions will be raised. And I think you'll have, there are corruption charges against today Zelensky's close circle. Now people will say, look, the same guy was being hailed as a hero.
Yeah.
Now he'll be hailed as a betrayer, as someone who let down the country, or you could say, look, he allowed this loss for nothing.
Yeah.
So all kinds of arguments will be made. And I think when you lose, the number of people will throw stones at you, will always be more. And if you win, everything else is what is it they say in Hindi, Saukun Maaf. I mean, that you
Yeah.
can really get away with it if you win. So I think it's really for Ukrainian people, you lost your sovereignty, you're going to have controls on your how much army you can keep,
Yeah.
and your security guarantees will be a shell. So this, I think, this brings me to the last point. I mean, I think that smaller countries, dealing with the bigger powers, particularly when they're neighbors, there has to be this balance. Do you provoke into perpetual conflict and then you lose even more? You can bring outside powers to balance the neighbor, but the guys who come to balance have their own interests. So I think then you tie yourself into the logic of others, and I think that is the danger. And I think that's where he's really got himself 3 years of standing up, and now there is corruption charges against him. The Ukraine is
Yeah.
losing people. Ukraine is a smaller country, so all that factors I think come. That's why, as Zelensky said, is a dignity or surrender. I mean, I think that's where how you manage this is going
Yeah.
to be very, very difficult for him.
Before going on to US, Russia, Europe, which now the writing's been on the wall from the first term of Donald Trump, he said, be responsible for your own security. This is not a free ride. That whole post-World War II architecture, he's all but said it, is that's not how business is going to be done anymore, or American support is not what you've been used to. Now, again, now you can see Europe fulminating and say, no, no, we'll stand with Ukraine and things like that. But the reality is even now, isn't it the reality rather? I'm asking rather, is that Europe doesn't have either seemingly the will, it's not had for that kind of conflict abroad, which would, or with a power like Russia to say, put men on the ground or materials, or even the economic will to say spend the amounts it would need to truly back Ukraine. So, will there now be with Russia, I mean, with the possibility, like you say, of a E2, I mean, in Europe, US and Russia saying, all right, this is your sphere of
Mm.
influence, or this is what we'll allow, this is what we won't allow, and say Trump perhaps doing something similar with China, which is the fear in our part of the world. Do you think it's time, Europe especially, for it to rethink now? I mean, it cannot be pacifist and it
Yeah.
cannot be
Yes,
spending the
yeah.
welfare state money, as it has been.
I think they've started something to strengthen themselves. I think they woke up too late, and the whole hope was Americans. For 75 years, Americans have done the heavy lifting. So Americans will continue to do it. So there is that duality in their position. On the one hand, say there's unprincipled, you can't reward an aggressor, all that is. But at the same time, they say America must stay in. So they can't replace the United States today. If everything current plans go, maybe 10 years down the road. But at this point, if the US pulls out, they can't really fill the gap. So the so-called peace plan over the last 48 hours was really Americans must stay on, but should not make compromises with Russia. So what they're going to do is really campaign in Washington, mobilize the opposition to Trump, uh, generate a lot of noise, which is what they'll do. So it's really a terrible position. Europe taking high moral ground without the material capacity to really stand their ground. And I think this is the other lesson that talking high language, high principle means nothing if you don't have the power to back it.
And speaking of Trump, like you point out in the piece, everyone read it on the IndianExpress.com, that Trump actually on Russia has suffered. I mean, he was called a Russian agent in his first term for his perceived closeness with Putin and this. But he's seemingly either not bought into the American idea of Russia as the great Eastern evil or rival. He also seems to, on this particular thing, saying, make the deal, make the compromise. He wants to push that through. How much of, you point out how difficult it is domestically for him to overcome several within the state, perhaps within his own party. But how much of this is, will it, like we saw Trump's attitude to China really bleeding into the Biden administration, in certain fundamental ways Biden continued those policies. How much do you think, if certainly it's all hypothetical now, but if there is a peace plan, if Russia has given certain guarantees in Ukraine, how much of that outlasts Trump in, say, for 5 years down the line or 3 years down?
I think, the it's interesting contrast between Russia and China. I mean, I think, look, the large section of the American establishment feels both of them are threats
Yeah.
in different ways. Russia threatens European stability. China is going to gain dominance over Asia. But I think the difference is that Russia has no friends in Washington. while China has a lot, because of the commercial relationship. With China, you have $1 trillion relationship. So the business companies say, look, let's not fight with China. When you see Jensen Huang with NVIDIA, the IT guys say, no, we must keep exporting to China. We must get cheap goods from China. But Russia has no such constituency because Russia never could manage to build an economic relationship. The only way it had negative leverage in terms of nuclear weapons can disrupt the peace in Europe. So I think it's a problem in terms of for Trump. There are not many who will support him. The only people who are supporting him on Ukraine are the MAGA right wing, which says, look, why are we in this war? Why are we committing our troops? Why are we giving more and more money to Ukraine when you need to do things at home? So that's America first argument. Those people see, look, US should get out.
Yeah.
And then there is a third small section in the strategic community, which says, look, having a decent relationship with Russia is important to deal with China. And I think this argument that you should not let Eurasia dominated by one power or coalition of powers. That means, say, a China-Russia combination should not dominate Eurasian landmass. That is a continuous theme in American strategic thinking. But I think the way the Ukraine policy played out, actually you got the Russians and Chinese closer.
Yeah.
And the assumption that US does not have to deal with either side, that I think is being tested. And I think that's where whether Trump's argument that, look, let the Europeans take care of European security, let's have a reasonable relationship with Russia, and then you can focus your energies on Asia. So I think that element of the strategic thinking would back Trump. But these are I'm talking about people who sit in the closed door rooms.
Yeah.
But at the political level is only MAGA
Yeah.
that supports a withdrawal from Ukraine, and that whatever the price, they're not going to say, look, you appease Russia. So you'll have support from that quarter, which is very substantive. But the establishment in Washington, the New York Times, everyone is going to say, this guy's selling out, this guy's selling out.
Yeah.
Without saying, look, do you continue this for another 10 years?
Yeah, exactly.
Do you keep supporting an unwinnable war?
Yeah. Yeah.
Can Ukraine's sovereignty can be fully restored?
Yeah.
I think they don't answer those questions. It merely then becomes a way of attacking Trump, both the liberal and the hardliners. So my sense is Trump still has a chance to say, look, screw you all, I'm going to do this deal.
Yeah.
But let's see what happens in the next few weeks.
So final quick question, please deal with it, of course, but Delhi's been facing sanctions for having some ties with Russia while Trump is trying to make this deal. We're all aware of that hypocrisy. But Russia, China being close together has been a source of some worry in Delhi. Just it's your largest defense supplier and your neighboring superpower with whom you have major border disputes. So if there is a sort of there's, as you point out, if there's greater flux in the two superpowers plus Russia, let's say, in the current, which in US, China is certainly evolving on a weekly basis sometimes. And now if Russia is also, friendly with America, and there are ways of, or is not in a sort of quasi-conflict with the West or with America. How do you see that help Delhi? And what is it? Where have we lost ground recently where we might be able to gain it again?
Yeah, I think, we've taken some things for granted as if Russia and US will never get together, or US and China will not get together. So I think what we need to recognize is there is so much of flux between US, China, Russia, and the relationships will continue to see shifts depending on the moment and circumstances. So the idea that somehow we can always be with Russia, whatever happens, this notion of if you have a problem with America, we can just go back to Russia. I think these are facile assumptions because you feel more comfortable with those kind of assumptions. But I think the challenging task for India is, look, there is a dynamic situation between US, China, and Russia. Friends, enemies, frenemies, all kinds of relationships, the aspects of the relationship that they'll have. Therefore, I think for us to focus on your own interests, rather than saying, look, Russia is bad, America is good, or America is bad and Russia is good, or China is bad or good. So I think for us is, look, how do we make sure we don't get caught like we did on the oil issue? And that we are paying a price for the shifts in geopolitics. Therefore, I think for our thing should be, how do we strengthen ourselves? How do we go from 4 trillion to 10 trillion over the next few years, and how do we strengthen our own position? So especially in the past, look, okay, say in the Cold War, the lines were clearly drawn.
Yeah.
But even then we saw US becoming friendly to China, Russia falling apart, China, Russia coming together. So I think we got to be far more dynamic, more accepting of changes internationally, and not to forget the core objective. How do I become stronger? How do I make my economy bigger? Rather than getting into this grand positions about this multi-alignment, the type of arguments really make no sense. The thing is, look, what is in it for me? So it has to be that core assumption.
Right. Right, sir. Thank you so much, everyone. Read the piece and we'll speak again next week. So thank you so much.